Thanks so much for joining us at this SwiftFox Red Fox combined webinar. We'll be talking you through the census, which will obviously be out on the 28th of June. It's been our experience that people know that the census is important, but don't necessarily know how to actually use it for campaigning or for the full potential of business. So we'll be explaining how you might be able to use it in your organisation today. So how this will work is that we have some behind the scenes magic people who will be feeding through questions to me and to Zach and Jaxen. So I'm Isabel, I'm Head of Engagement at the Red Fox Group. And Zach and Jaxen, you might want to introduce yourselves as well.
I'm Zach Alexopoulos. I'm the Head of Analytics at the Red Fox Group. I was trained as an economist, but I've worked as a pollster, as a data director on national campaigns, and as a government advisor. And in all of those, I used census data for all of those jobs for many different reasons. The data from the first census I ever used was from 2001. So I've been wrestling with census data for a while.
That's great. Okay, good to wrestle. Jaxen, how about yourself?
So I'm Jaxen Wood. I'm the Senior Data Scientist here at the Red Fox Group. Like Zach, I've been playing around with data and the census for over a decade now. And I have, I still remember playing around with custom shapes in Google Earth and analyzing custom areas in the census. And now I'm, mapping multiple responses to analyze trends and patterns. So I think it's fair to say I'm very excited for Tuesday's data release.
Fantastic. That's great. Custom shapes on Google as well sound very intriguing. So I might start with the most obvious question first, which is, what is the census and why is this particular census important?
So every 5 years, the Australian Bureau of Statistics conducts a complete count of every person in Australia. That is the census. It took place on the 10th of August last year. The first results, as we've alluded to, are released on Tuesday. But it doesn't just ask how many people live in this household. It also asks over 60 different questions about the people who live there, about the house, the physical house or dwelling itself. And we will go through many of those in more detail during this webinar.
Great. And Jaxen, is there anything you'd like to add there?
I think one of the things that I'm certainly most excited for in the census is just seeing how we as a nation have changed, because it's obviously the biggest survey that we conduct every 5 years, and it's the most complete survey that takes place. And so being able to see, across the entire of Australia, how have we moved from 2016? What do families look like that they, didn't look like before? How has the economy changed? What industries are we working in? What areas are we living in? How are we driving to work? What religion are we associated with? So it is, I think that's sort of the thing that I go to first. How have we changed as a country before digging down deep?
Right. And it will be fascinating, of course, with so many big things happening since 2016, notably some lockdowns and a bit of a pandemic. So that will be very interesting. Jaxen, I think, Zach, you sort of covered a bit before, but around geography, what geography does the census cover?
So obviously, the census was conducted against every single person, and so there exists a database somewhere with millions of survey results for every person. Now, obviously, they don't give us that, but what they do is they aggregate those answers together into multiple areas, and then they provide us that. So obviously, Australia is not just divided into states and territories, and so we have the results for each state and territory, but we also have the data down much deeper than that as well. What I will do is I will share my screen and I can illustrate that quite easily. So Australia is comprised of a number of building blocks, so to speak. And so the very lowest form of building block is a mesh block, where there's 387,000 mesh blocks that cover all of Australia without gap or overlap. One level up from that is an SA1 or statistical area level 1. This is where the fun starts, because this is what the smallest area that the ABS will release census data on. So on this map here, we can see a number of SA1s that are covering the Greater Melbourne area. Australia is covered by 61,000 SA1s. Each one of them has a unique number or identifier. And so for every single SA1, we can find out from the census how many people there were, what ages they are, what occupations, what industries, how they get to work, how many children, what their ancestry is. So every single census question, for every SA1, we have the responses. Moving up from SA1s though, SA1s come together and they form SA2s. And so this is where like it's a small suburb. And so what we can then do is, again, get all the results from those SA2s. We've also got SA3s, which are sort of smaller council areas. And then we've got SA4s, which are sort of much larger areas around the state. The census doesn't just release data on these geographies that the ABS creates. They'll also give us census data on postal areas and suburbs and local government areas and electorates. So on any sort of those areas that you're used to dealing with, you can pull up the census and you can find out how many people there were and how many of them have finished school. So for instance.
Wow. And just a reminder, because we've got a question coming through just then, which was how often do SA1/SA2 boundaries change? So for anyone, feel free to just ping through a question and we'll make sure to answer it.
The answer is that for every census, the ABS updates not just SA1s, but every piece of geography, because SA1s have to nest inside SA2s and SA3s and so on. But in the lead up to every census, the ABS will attempt to redraw SA1 boundaries to ensure that SA1s have approximately the same number of people. So on average, an SA1 will have about 400 people living there. Some are a bit bigger, some are a bit smaller, but they all average out to be about that size. Obviously, there are areas of Australia that have had high population growth, both apartment developments in the inner city and suburban fringe estates on the edges of capital cities. What will often happen is that one SA1 will be divided into multiple SA1s when the population growth gets to that point. For example, at the last census in 2016, there was one SA1 in Melton, which is on the outer west of Melbourne, that was one SA1 in 2011, but became 27 SA1s in 2016. Wow. And the same thing has happened up in Sydney in Marsden Park. There was one SA1 in Marsden Park in 2016 that became close to 30 SA1s this time around. So the answer is every 5 years before the census, they're redrawn and the data gets put out on those new SA1s. The other factor I would add about data and geography is that you're not just limited to the data that the census directly puts out. If you want census data at a level that isn't covered by the census, say a company's sales regions, for example, or school catchment areas, you can approximate the data for that by adding up the SA1s that overlap with that area. So if you have a company's sales areas, you can take all the SA1s that overlap with those sales areas and add up the data for those SA1s. That gives you a number for that other piece of geography. So you're not just limited to what's in the census release.
Great. And we'll sort of be getting into the different things that you can use a bit later as well. Might also be good to sort of look at, what was the most common Australian in 2016? And, that might change too. So do you remember who that was?
So in 2016, the average Australian was a 38-year-old woman who had a household income of about $1,400 a week, did not have any qualifications beyond year 12, and lived in a capital city. And was most likely to be of English, Australian, Irish, Scottish, or perhaps Chinese ancestry, and was very likely to be born in Australia. So that's our baseline for this time round. And as Jaxen alludes to, it will be very interesting to see how that has shifted.
Great. So final sort of context question is, what's different about the census this year and what new questions were added in 2021?
So as we approach every census, there's always a very large planning period, as you could imagine. The planning period is actually so big that they had started planning the 2021 census while the 2016 census was still underway. So there's years and years that go into this, and as part of that process is obviously the topics or questions that get asked. And so one of the things that was added for the 2021 census was adding 2 new questions, and that was on the Defence Force, and that was also on mental health conditions. Zach, you've got a bit of detail on both of those.
So there was a question that was asked for the first time in the 2021 census about whether you have ever served in the Defence Force, both reserves and full-time. There was also a new question about long-term health conditions. So that covers asthma, diabetes, heart disease, things like that, but it also covers mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. To make room for those questions, there had previously been a question on whether the dwelling that people live in, the house that they live in, whether it's connected to the internet. In 2016, the definition of having internet access was expanded to, do you have a smartphone, essentially? So smartphones count as internet. But because smartphones have proliferated so much and internet penetration is so high, a decision was made that that question would be dropped, that knowing how many households have the internet is no longer useful for most purposes now. So that question was removed. The 2 new questions were put in. There are also lots of little definitional changes that were made, most of which are only of interest to nerds like Jaxen and me. But one that's worth mentioning is that one thing that's changed between the 2016 census and now is that same-sex couples can now marry in Australia. In 2016, that was not the case. So that means that the census category of people in a registered marriage now includes same-sex couples. The output looks the same, but it's calculated a bit differently under the surface. And one trend we've seen in Australia for a while is that marriage rates have been declining, as is the case around the Western world. But it's likely that the number of people who are married will take a jump in 2021 because same-sex married couples are now included.
Great. We might sort of get into how we can apply this. So let's say I'm a not-for-profit specializing in mental health services, say like a Beyond Blue or a Headspace. How am I using the census this year?
We'll absolutely be using the new question that was put in place about long-term mental health conditions. We have never before had this kind of data down to that level before. You've had population-wide surveys, you've had estimates at various large pieces of geography. You've never had it down to suburb level, local, like clean local government area data, down to almost to street level. You've never had that before. And not only that, that data can be cross-tabbed by gender, by age, by how recently you've moved, by cultural background, by family structure, by type of household situation. Do you rent your house? Do you own your house? Do you have a mortgage on it? You can cross-match that data by anything that's in the census. And that will help you if you're that kind of NGO. One, in terms of citing clinics, so knowing and citing treatment, knowing where that there is a demand for those services and what sort of people are most likely to need them. Is there a large number of people of a particular age, people of a particular cultural background, people from a particular part of the country that are reporting these conditions, but don't live in areas where there are large numbers of services. So that helps services. So that data will help you be able to, one, decide where you send your services to, but also the sorts of clinicians you'll hire, the sorts of outreach you'll need to do, anything to get more people through your doors. You'll be able to use data to make those decisions in a way you haven't been able to before.
Jaxen, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of those steps for that NGO?
No, I think that it really, this new question is really going to be a big new source of information for many people, and particularly for people like Zach and I, who can then give those results and analysis to other organisations. Having, as I said at the start, this is the biggest survey that we do every 5 years. So having that down to an SA1 level means that we can see precisely where people are and how that can impact other things.
Right. And so you listed sort of a lot of things that we can look there. Zach, where could we find that information? Jaxen, that might be another one for you.
What I might do is I'll load up the Census website so that we can have a look at some of the resources and tools that they have on offer. I will preface that the website is a bit of a maze, and certainly over Zach and my time using the census, we begin to learn the intricacies of where things are. But there are a number of really useful tools for those sort of beginners, and then there are some also very powerful tools for those that are wanting to really start digging deep. So on the Census website, abs.gov.au/census, they have a search by area ability where you can search for any suburb or postcode or local government area or even an SA1, and you can get all number of stats for that area. So here, if I bring up the suburb of West End, I can see a suburb here. I then get access to some quick stats, and I can see, and this is obviously 2016 data, but this time next week, I'll be seeing 2021. I can see all of the sort of breakdowns of this area that I've selected, how it compares to the state and the country. So that's the quick stats, which is really useful for getting an overview of a particular area. They also have a community profile, which I can download an Excel document, and then I can see of all the topics or questions, what's the breakdown precisely within that area. What Zach and I will actually be heading towards is the census data tools. And so this is where we can download the data packs, which is just a whole series of CSVs where we can, then put them into our own sort of database and manipulate them, combining all the different geography types with all the questions. But the ABS also has a really powerful table builder. And this is where you can combine questions together, combine different geographies, and really drill down to exactly what you're looking for. So between all the different offerings, the ABS certainly has a lot of choices for what you're looking for.
And we should say, if you get stuck, please feel free to message us a question, and we can show you where to go for free. So moving on from sort of the mental health NGO example, let's say I am wanting to set up a co-working space in Brisbane, where you are, Jaxen, but I don't care where. How can the sort of census help me choose the best location within Brisbane?
So this is probably one where I would be heading to Table Builder on the ABS website, because one of the abilities from Table Builder is actually to view the results on a map. So what I could then do is load up the suburbs that I'm after, and then start bringing in all of the industries that I think would be ripe for a shared working space. I can then probably filter that down by people who cycle to work or catch public transport, so that I can really start, drilling down on the types of people that I think I could start marketing towards. What I could then do is view that on the map and identify those areas with high proportions of people that fit my target group of people to help me choose, what location is going to work well for this co-working space.
Great.
Yep.
And you touched on it a bit before, but if I was going to market to those people, again, how can I use the census to direct my marketing campaign?
Well, once I've identified my target group of people, Table Builder could then let me better understand the demographics of that group. So I could easily find out the age and gender breakdowns. I could work out whether they, what precisely they look like. And then I could use some online marketing tools to pin down my, online advertising to target that exact group of people. What I could also do is then start identifying, well, maybe these people have a lot of young kids. I need to add a childcare service to my shared working space to really entice them into that area. I've loaded up a map here to just give you a bit of an illustration of some of those general concepts. So, if I had a map, I could then load in the density of people that are catching public transport to work. I could also perhaps bring in young adults and see, what areas have an over proportion of younger adults. I could then bring in, suburb boundaries to see precisely what they are. I should point out that I'm visualizing all of this in our SwiftFox platform, but the Table Builder on the ABS website has similar functionality.
And on the question of the co-working space as well, there are several releases of census data. The main one comes out on Tuesday next week. But for the Citing the Co-working space, you'd be interested in data on industry and occupation, which comes out in October. And that allows you to see not only the sorts of people who live in an area where that, like the sorts of industries they work in and the sorts of jobs that they do. You can also show that data not just by where they live, but where they work. So you can do, so for example, in the census data, I will be captured not only in my house in Chippendale, but also at my workplace here in Darlinghurst. So and what that will allow you to do in terms of marketing is that you'll be able to see, both in terms of where people live and where they work, you'll be able to see the sorts of industries that are overrepresented there, and that will allow you to target those particular industries to come and be tenants in your co-working space. Say you find that you have a lot of people in what the ABS quaintly calls computer system design and related services, i.e. tech companies. If there are lots of people living in the area that you want to have your co-working space in, you focus on tech companies to go in there. Or it might be accounting firms, it might be graphic designers. All of that data will be available in the second release in October.
Great. Yeah, we'll have a very exciting few months ahead of us. So obviously we touched on it before, pandemic. What will be most interesting for organizations to learn after the past few years through the census? Or it might not be pandemic, anything.
There are two. The thing that comes to mind the most for me is population shifts. In that every year the ABS puts out what it calls estimated resident population that attempts to track population movements. But that data isn't as comprehensive as a complete count that you get in the census. And two, you don't get that data below SA2 level. So you don't have it like down to the really fine-grained pieces of geography the census can give you. And we know from that population data that there has been a shift out of capital cities. In particular, there's been a shift out of Melbourne into regional Victoria. There's also been movements to WA and to Queensland. But the extent of that shift and the sorts of people who are shifting, again, in terms of where they work, their backgrounds, their cultural diversity, that sort of data you'll only know from the census. And that will be helpful in terms of deciding, again, who you should market to, where you should put your news sites, where you should focus, even where you should focus outdoor advertising. Knowing that data, knowing the sorts of people who are moving and how many of them have moved in the last 5 years, that will be extremely useful to know.
Jaxen, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
I will only add it very, very quickly because I know that we'd love to get some audience questions in, particularly on the idea of the getting accurate population numbers. What we'll have seen earlier in the dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic was vaccination numbers, and reporting on those was a very crucial element to, when lockdowns would end and when we could cross state borders. But quite often there was always talk of particular vaccination numbers not being accurate. Obviously, we know roughly how many people had received a vaccination, but because population numbers were so out of date, we didn't know what the denominator was, or we didn't know how many people lived in that local government area. So having accurate population numbers from the census now is going to mean that we actually know, vaccination rates, for instance.
Yeah. So for example, in some fast growing outer suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, the estimated vaccination rate was more than 100%, because you're using vaccination data from 2021 and population data from 2019. And so you're using two different data sources that were taken at different times. And so you ended up with, in some cases, nonsensical numbers.
Great. So we have had some audience questions come through. This is a good one, which is, I don't have any experience in data or analytics. Where do I start with the census?
As I was showing, the quick stats and that community profile are two really great places to start getting an idea on what your suburb or your postcode or your local government area looks like, how it compares to your state and your country. So you can get an idea of, my average age of the suburb is actually so much lower than the whole state. we must have a lot of young people. So that's, it gives you a really quick idea of what you look like. And then you can start looking at other suburbs and other suburbs. As you begin to get more comfortable with the topics and the questions in the census, that's when you can start investigating the table builder. It is an advanced tool, but there are some good online resources to help you with that. And as Izzy certainly mentioned, if you're having trouble, identifying where the data is or what tool to use, we're more than happy to point you in the right direction.
Great. We've also got a question through about what the difference was between the table builder and the community profiles.
The community profile is an Excel document about a specific boundary, so a postcode or a suburb or a local government area. It will then have a tab for every single topic or question, and it will give you a complete breakdown of how different people answered that question or topic. The table builder, however, is the powerful tool where you can filter down and say, I want to see these suburbs, and I want to see people that answered that they drive to work, and I want to see people that have children at home, and then it will tell you how many people fit that criteria. And so it lets you, combine multiple things together and drill down to a table, convert it to a map. So it is that sort of next level.
The other factor is that Table Builder is a lot more flexible in terms of the crosstabs that it gives you. So setting out one variable according to another variable. The other is that it goes down into a lot more detail in some of the big categories. So say industries, for example, I mentioned computer system design and related services before. In the community profile, that's
everyone. Yeah.
That will be, let me go at it another way. In terms of occupations, you might have professionals, for example, but say that you are in the healthcare sector and you want to know the number of doctors or the number of nurses. That you can't get in the community profile because it doesn't go down that far. The table builder, you can go all the way deep into the occupational categories and actually pull up the number of doctors and then break doctors down by geography, age, gender, whatever else you want.
Great. Now, we've also got another question, which we sort of touched on with the co-working space, but it's, if I'm looking to open a new business, what should I be looking at? And just a reminder to everyone, if you just go through the chat, if you just message in the chat, then those questions will be fed through to me. So yeah, if I'm looking to open a new business, what things should I be looking at?
It depends on your business. It depends on who you're hoping to sell to, where physically you're hoping to locate or not locate at all, be entirely remote. I would say, but the things that are kind of timeless are population growth, income, occupation, and family structure. And so if you're opening a business that's going to be selling, kids' clothes, for example, you want to find not just areas with lots of kids, but areas with lots of new kids, like new babies, under fours, for example, because you're not just going to be selling clothes to babies when they're under 1 year old. You're going to be selling them to them for years after that. And that data is all in the census. Conversely, if you're selling, products to young trendy adults who like going to bars every night, you might want to find the sorts of places who have lots of people who are aged in their 20s. If you're looking at homewares, for example, you might want to go for areas that have lots of people who own their house or for example, you can combine two things: people who own their house but have moved in the last year, who are likely to have just bought recently. So depends exactly what you want. It's the list is as long as your arm, but think about who you want to sell to, and the chances are there's something in the census that can be very helpful in finding where those people are and how quickly the number is growing and other factors about them.
And you can see there how that would direct a marketing campaign as well.
Exactly.
Zach has obviously mentioned quite a number of the topics or questions from the census. One of the easiest ways that I always find to wrap my head around all of them is the community profile, because that means that by looking at your suburb, you can then go through and look at each topic and question and see, there's a question on what's your ancestry? And then you can get an idea of the answers. There's a topic on how do you get to work? And then there's all the answers. That can then start sparking your ideas around how you can then investigate, as Zach was saying.
Right. Another audience question. In terms of population projections, does the census include population forecasts by small areas? So the SA1s and the SA2s? And if not, does the team have any tips on how to estimate future population by small area?
So the answer is no. The census is a snapshot. It's not a forecast. So it's a snapshot of Australia as it was on the 10th of August, 2021. There's no attempt made to project that into the future at all. In terms of population forecasts, those are always a notoriously fraught thing to do, especially when a global pandemic drops in between censuses. Two ways around that. The first is that even if you just look at the population growth from 2016 to 2021, that can often tell you quite a lot. In terms of future population projections, this is not in the census, but it's another handy thing the ABS puts out. Every month, they put out building approvals down to, I think, SA2 level. And so that's the number of dwellings.
Everyone SA2 level
is a large suburb or group of smaller suburbs.
So an example being from
for Victoria, Richmond. So the 3121 postcode, so Richmond, Cremorne, Burnley, that is an SA2, where in Sydney, I'm trying to not make it up here, but my recollection is that where I am in Chippendale, there is a Redfern Chippendale SA2. Brisbane, I think Jaxen, there is a West End SA2, and that covers most of the east coast of Australia.
There's building approvals for SA2s.
Yeah, building approvals at SA2s, and those are derived from local government, and you can restrict that to just new houses. So it also shows renovations, like that kind of building approval, but it also shows new housing. And in places that have had a lot of new housing approved, whether it's again suburban fringe estates or apartments in the inner city, in a few years' time, those apartments will have people move into them. And so places that have a high building approval rate now are likely to have a high population growth in a couple of years' time. And so in terms of looking at where there's likely to be a population explosion in the next few years, that's the first metric I'd look at.
And Jaxen, anything to add on that?
On the topic of population projections, I did just want to show off the SwiftFox again, because one of the things we have got in here is population projections down by SA2. And so by using those projections and combining them with census data and with some of the, the boundaries that we have, such as suburbs, that's where you can, combine all these free public data sets together and get an idea of, where the population is going, as Zach was alluding to.
Great. So look at building approvals and growth patterns and things. Great. We've had one more question come through just then. What are you most looking forward to finding out in the census results next week?
I think, as I mentioned at the start of this, the thing that I head straight to is just the Australian result, seeing the change in the nation. After that, I'll be digging into some of the detail around, suburbs and how they've changed over time and what, growth patterns there's been in certain areas. But for me, the census is about a snapshot of the country and seeing how we have changed, what, family structures look like and religions and things like that. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
I'm going the other end from Jaxen, and that is I'm really interested in. So for 2 years, essentially, we didn't have any in-migration into Australia. So no international students, very, very little incoming migration. The incoming passenger numbers every month were tiny. So parts of Australia that are close to universities or that have lots of newly arrived migrants, it's widely believed a lot of them had a substantial population dip in the last couple of years. And so seeing the extent of that dip and being able to map that down to SA1 level and seeing exactly where had the largest depopulation, especially in inner Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, that's what I'm most interested in seeing.
Wow. Technical one, what mapping tools do you recommend? I think we saw some of those mapping tools before, but yeah, Jaxen, what mapping tools do you recommend?
Like, I believe, so once you wanted to start getting into the mapping side of things, as I mentioned, Table Builder has a very useful mapping tool built into it. And so once you're looking at a result, you can then convert it directly to a map. What Zach and I will often do, though, is we'll be downloading the results from Table Builder or from the data packs, which I also mentioned, and we'll be putting them into either QGIS, which is a free online open source mapping tool, or, as I was illustrating before, SwiftFox, which is our CRM platform that we can, combine multiple public data sets together and some of our own private data sets to, see and poke and prod all of the data.
Great. All right, well, we might, do the community profiles only come in Excel format? One more.
They do, yes, because they have quite a bit of formatting in them and multiple tabs. They are an Excel-based document, but obviously you could get the tab you want and convert it to CSV and then do some other things from there. Because it is quite formatted, though, it is a display, a formatted document as opposed to a CSV data document.
Okay. So for Excel lovers, it's great. What sort of help do you expect clients will ask for? That's an interesting one.
I would put that into three main categories. The first of those is conceptual. So what can the census tell me? How can it help me make decisions? How can it help me improve my business? How can it help me get a broader audience for more people? That's the first one. The second of those is probably more technical. As Jaxen said, the ABS website is very, very much a maze if you don't know your way around it well. And a lot of the especially once you get beyond quick stats into the actual data tables, some of the jargon isn't intuitive, and so knowing what you're looking for, so guiding clients to around the technical side is another part. A third part is interpretation. So it's one thing to say, here is all this data. It's another thing to know what it means. Like, what decisions do you take from this? We've seen this shift in population. We've seen this shift in cultural diversity. We've seen this shift in occupation and industry types, but how does that help me? That interpretation is most of the census work that Jaxen and I do for clients. And as I say, we've been looking at this data for 2001, and I suspect that's where a lot of the work we do for clients, it will focus on that part.
Yeah. Can really be any sort of client thing as well. What does this mean? What is it? How can we use it? And a lot of sort of marketing campaigns as well. How can we grow this particular, our business, etc. All right. Well, we might leave it there, but we will be putting out lots of information on the census and on our LinkedIn as well. So please go and like it, because it'll make us feel better about giving away things for free. And I might just say, thanks to everyone so much for coming. And thank you to Lucy and Ella for forwarding all those questions to me behind the scenes. And a special thank you to Jaxen and Zach, and as well SwiftFox for letting us use all your maps. So thank you so much.